Dear learners, welcome back to another episode of WSE English Story, where history meets language learning, and every word brings you closer to understanding the human spirit. Today, we travel back to a time of thunder on the battlefield, when Europe trembled in chaos and division. Out of that storm rose a young king who would change the course of warfare, faith, and destiny itself. His name was Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, remembered in history as the Lion of the North. This is not just a story of victories and battles. It is the journey of a man who faced impossible odds, carried the weight of his people, and transformed himself into a symbol of courage and innovation. His life was not long, but it burned with a brilliance that still inspires leaders and dreamers today. As you listen, you will not only improve your English skills, but also discover a powerful lesson about resilience, vision, and sacrifice. Remember, dear learners, the stories we tell are bridges. They connect language with meaning, and history with your own journey of growth. So, if you find value in these stories, support our work by liking, commenting, and sharing. Your encouragement helps us continue bringing you tales that matter. Get ready for the thrilling rise of Gustavus Adolphus, the Lion of the North who changed warfare forever. Let's begin the journey. At the dawn of the 17th century, Europe was a continent divided. Ancient kingdoms and rising empires jostled for power. Faith itself had become a battlefield. Protestant and Catholic states clashed not only with swords but with ideals that cut deep into people's lives. In this atmosphere of constant tension, Sweden was still a relatively modest kingdom, far from the grandeur of Spain, France, or the Holy Roman Empire. Yet it was here, in Stockholm, on December 9, 1594, that Gustavus Adolphus was born. His father, Charles IX of Sweden, was a stern and determined ruler. Charles had seized the crown after a bitter struggle, breaking with rival branches of the royal family. His reign was marked by conflict with both powerful neighbors and domestic nobles who doubted his legitimacy. Gustavus's mother, Christina of Holstein-Gottorp, was strong-willed, deeply religious, and protective of her children. From both parents, the young prince inherited a sense of destiny and responsibility. Gustavus grew up in a palace surrounded not by luxury alone, but by the sounds of argument, planning, and political unrest. Sweden was small, yet its position in northern Europe was strategic, a land of forests, iron, and cold seas, but also a gate to the Baltic trade routes. Whoever controlled this region could influence the balance of power across the continent. The boy's childhood was far from carefree. At just a few years old, he witnessed wars with Denmark and Russia. He listened as adults discussed strategies and betrayals. He learned that a king's crown was never secure unless backed by strength and wisdom. Unlike other children of noble birth who might focus on games or poetry, Gustavus was taught to read military maps, memorize the Bible, and practice speeches in both Swedish and Latin. His education was not only about knowledge, but about preparing him to rule in a world where one mistake could bring down a dynasty. By his teenage years, it was clear he was no ordinary prince. He had a sharp memory, a commanding voice, and an unusual gift for languages. He could speak Swedish, German, Dutch, and some Polish, an ability that later helped him negotiate with allies and rivals across Europe. His tutors described him as both serious and energetic, a boy who carried himself with a sense of purpose beyond his age. Still, the shadow of danger always loomed. Sweden's enemies were many, and alliances shifted like the winds of the Baltic. Gustavus would grow up knowing that his life was not only his own, it belonged to his nation, and perhaps, to history itself. When Gustavus Adolphus was only 16 years old, his world changed forever. His father, King Charles IX, passed away in 1611, leaving the throne to a boy who was still in the process of becoming a man. The crown was heavy, and Sweden stood at a dangerous crossroads. The kingdom was surrounded by powerful enemies, and Gustavus inherited not peace, but war. At the very moment he ascended the throne, Sweden faced three major threats at once. To the west, Denmark sought to dominate the Baltic and humiliate Sweden. To the east, Russia was unstable but still dangerous, its ambitions stretching across the cold northern frontiers. And to the south, Poland presented a special challenge. Its king, Sigismund III, was none other than Gustavus's own cousin, and a man who believed he was the rightful ruler of Sweden. This tangled web of family rivalry and international politics placed young Gustavus in one of the most difficult positions imaginable. The early months of his reign tested him severely. Denmark invaded almost immediately, forcing him into the brutal Kalmar War. Swedish forces were poorly prepared, their treasury nearly empty, and their army inexperienced. Gustavus himself had to appear on the battlefield to inspire his men, even though he had only just taken the throne. Imagine for a moment what it must have felt like, barely older than a schoolboy, standing before hardened soldiers, demanding loyalty while his enemies mocked him as a child king. But Gustavus did not crumble. He spoke with conviction, he rode at the front, and he showed that courage was not measured by years. Though Sweden suffered defeats and humiliating concessions, his presence ignited respect among his people. He began to understand that leadership was not about being flawless, but about carrying burdens with unshakable resolve. Inside his kingdom, Gustavus faced another difficulty. Sweden's nobility and council were cautious of giving too much power to such a young monarch. They placed restrictions on his rule, forcing him to share authority until he turned 24. For many rulers, this would have been a humiliation. For Gustavus, it was a training ground. He learned to navigate politics, to persuade and compromise, and to win people's trust not by demanding obedience, but by earning it. This period also sharpened his awareness of a deeper problem. Sweden was strong in spirit, but weak in resources. Its armies were often outnumbered, its economy fragile, its people spread across a harsh landscape. If he wanted to defend his crown and lift his nation to greatness, Gustavus would need not only bravery, but also innovation. He could not simply copy the methods of larger, wealthier powers. He would have to rethink the art of war itself. Thus, the first years of Gustavus's reign were marked by hardship and humiliation, but within those struggles a seed was planted, the realization that survival required transformation. The boy king who had been mocked was becoming a visionary, quietly preparing for the battles that would one day change Europe. Gustavus Adolphus's early reign was a baptism by fire. Though still a teenager, he found himself commanding armies, negotiating with nobles, and making decisions that could determine the survival of his kingdom. Instead of being crushed by these burdens, he turned them into fuel for transformation. The Kalmar War with Denmark ended in 1613 with Sweden forced to accept harsh terms. For many rulers, such a defeat would have left a scar of bitterness. But Gustavus treated it as a lesson. He had seen with his own eyes the weakness of Sweden's forces, poorly trained soldiers, outdated equipment, and a lack of coordination. If Sweden was to survive, this had to change. Gustavus threw himself into reform. He reorganized the army, introducing structures that emphasized discipline, flexibility, and innovation. Instead of relying on mercenaries alone, he created a system that combined professional soldiers with conscripts drawn from the peasantry. Every village had a role to play, every community contributed men, and in return, those soldiers were trained, paid, and treated with a dignity that was rare in that era. It was a social contract. The king asked for service, but he also gave protection and respect. He also reimagined tactics. Rather than relying on heavy, immovable blocks of pikemen and cavalry charges, he introduced smaller, more mobile units. He gave greater importance to musketeers and artillery, training his men to move swiftly, fire in coordinated volleys, and support each other across the battlefield. What he was building was not just an army, it was the blueprint of modern warfare. But theory is nothing without practice, and Gustavus soon faced more wars. To the east, Russia was unstable after years of civil conflict, yet still dangerous. From 1617 to 1618, Gustavus led Swedish armies deep into Russian territory, eventually forcing the Tsar to accept the Treaty of Stolbovo. This treaty secured Sweden's position on the Baltic, cutting Russia off from the sea and giving Gustavus valuable breathing space. It was not only a military victory, but a diplomatic triumph. Gustavus had shown that Sweden could negotiate from strength, and that even mighty neighbors could be forced to bend. Yet he knew that the greater challenge was still ahead. His cousin, Sigismund of Poland, continued to claim the Swedish throne, and their conflict threatened to erupt again and again. For nearly 2 decades, Gustavus would wage war with Poland, testing his reforms in battle after battle. These campaigns were not easy. The Polish cavalry, famous for its fearsome winged hussars, often outmatched Swedish forces in open combat. Gustavus's men endured bitter defeats as well as victories. Yet with every clash, his army grew stronger, and his leadership more respected. He never abandoned the field for long, and he learned to adapt constantly. It was during these years that Gustavus's reputation began to spread beyond Sweden. Other rulers heard of the young lion who rode at the front of his troops, who shared their dangers, and who prayed with them before battles. Soldiers followed him not because they feared his punishments, but because they believed in his cause. At home, his reforms were changing society itself. Villages that once feared conscription began to take pride in their contribution. Nobles who doubted his youth came to admire his vision. The crown that had once seemed too heavy now fit him like armor. Yet, for all his progress, Gustavus sensed that his true test had not yet arrived. The wars with Denmark, Russia, and Poland were necessary steps, but they were not the defining struggle. Beyond the horizon, Germany was descending into chaos as the 30 Years' War ripped the continent apart. Faith, power, and survival were colliding on a scale unseen before. And in that storm, Gustavus Adolphus would find his destiny. By the late 1620s, Europe was burning. The 30 Years' War, which had begun as a local conflict in the Holy Roman Empire, had spread like wildfire. Armies marched across the German lands, leaving behind smoking villages and starving peasants. What had started as a clash of religion, Protestant versus Catholic, had become a brutal struggle for power, territory, and survival. For Sweden, the war at first seemed distant. But Gustavus Adolphus knew better. If Catholic powers crushed the German Protestants, Sweden would be isolated, trapped between hostile forces. He also feared for the very soul of Europe. If one faith was imposed by force, there would be no room for freedom of belief. Yet entering the war was dangerous. Sweden was not a giant empire, it was still a small kingdom. To step into the heart of Europe meant risking everything. In 1629, he signed a truce with Poland, freeing his armies for greater tasks. The following year, he made the boldest decision of his life, Sweden would intervene in the 30 Years' War. In the summer of 1630, Gustavus landed with his army on the coast of Pomerania in northern Germany. It was a daring move. His army numbered only about 13,000 men, far smaller than the vast imperial forces commanded by generals like Tilly and Wallenstein. Many German princes looked at the young Swedish king with skepticism. Could this northern monarch, with his golden hair and commanding voice, really make a difference in the greatest war of the age? Gustavus answered not with words, but with discipline and innovation. He built alliances carefully, offering protection to Protestant cities that had suffered under imperial armies. Unlike many mercenary commanders who allowed their men to plunder, Gustavus kept his soldiers under strict control. Villages spared by his army began to see him not as another invader, but as a liberator. Slowly, he won trust where others had only sown fear. Then came his first great test, the Battle of Breitenfeld in 1631. Facing a much larger imperial force, Gustavus arranged his army in flexible lines, mixing musketeers with cavalry and artillery in a way that allowed them to support each other. His cannons were lighter and more mobile than those of his enemies, able to shift positions quickly during the fight. As the battle raged, his soldiers fired in disciplined volleys, while his cavalry struck with precision. The result was astonishing. For the first time in years, the imperial army suffered a crushing defeat. News of the Protestant victory spread like lightning across Europe. Cities rang bells in celebration, preachers declared it a sign of God's favor, and Gustavus Adolphus was hailed as the Lion of the North. This victory was more than a battlefield triumph. It was a turning point in the war, proving that the Catholic Habsburgs were not invincible. It gave hope to Protestant states and drew new allies to Sweden's side. Gustavus had stepped into the arena of European power and shown that even a smaller nation, with courage and innovation, could challenge giants. Yet the triumph also came with new burdens. Every victory meant higher expectations, every alliance demanded trust and resources, and every step forward risked disaster if fortune turned. Gustavus was no longer fighting only for Sweden, he was fighting for the balance of faith and power across an entire continent. Sometimes, one cannot help but wonder, what drives a man to take such risks? Was it ambition, faith, duty, or destiny? For Gustavus, it was likely all of these, bound together. He believed in protecting Protestantism, in defending his people, and in proving that justice could triumph over oppression. And so, with the roar of victory still echoing from Breitenfeld, he pressed on into Germany, determined to carry the war to its climax. The autumn of 1632 was heavy with smoke and uncertainty. For 2 years, Gustavus Adolphus had marched across Germany, defeating imperial armies and securing alliances. He had lifted the hopes of Protestants, restored cities, and shaken the confidence of the Catholic Habsburg Empire. Yet every triumph carried a shadow, for the enemy was far from broken. The brilliant General Wallenstein had returned to command the imperial forces, and his reputation for cunning strategy made even the most confident allies uneasy. The inevitable confrontation came on November 16, 1632, near the town of Lutzen. The morning was shrouded in dense mist, and the cold air cut like knives across the fields. Gustavus rode among his men, his presence aflame against the fog. He was dressed not in heavy armor, his old wounds made it painful to wear breastplates, but in a plain leather coat. His golden hair flowed in the wind, and his words echoed with calm conviction, "God is with us." Today, we fight not for ourselves alone, but for the freedom of all who believe. The battle began with thunder. Cannons roared, muskets cracked, and smoke mingled with the mist until the world seemed made of fire and shadow. Gustavus led his cavalry in charge after charge, his voice ringing above the chaos. Time and again, his men surged forward, inspired by the sight of their king at the very front. He fought not as a distant monarch, but as a soldier among soldiers. Yet fate is often cruel to those who shine the brightest. In the thick of combat, Gustavus's horse carried him deep into the smoke. Separated from his guards, he became an easy target. Bullets tore into his body, first his arm, then his back. He cried out, but pressed on until he could ride no further. At last, he fell from his horse, surrounded by the clash of steel and the cries of men who did not realize their king was gone. When his attendants reached him, it was too late. The Lion of the North lay lifeless on the blood-soaked field, his leather coat pierced, his body broken. The news spread like a whisper of horror across the Swedish ranks. Their king was dead. For a moment, despair threatened to consume them. But here lies the true climax, not only in Gustavus's sacrifice, but in the choice his men made. Instead of collapsing in grief, they rallied with renewed fury. For the king became their cry. His death ignited their courage, and the Swedish army surged forward, pushing back Wallenstein's forces. By the end of the day, the field of Lutzen belonged to the Swedes. Victory was theirs, but its price was immeasurable. Imagine the silence that followed. A triumphant army stood upon a field littered with the fallen, yet their leader lay among them. Soldiers wept openly, kneeling beside the body of the man who had led them with such fire. Allies across Europe mourned, while enemies felt both relief and fear. Gustavus Adolphus had given his life, and in doing so, he transformed from a mortal king into a legend. The emotional weight of Lutzen lies not only in his death, but in the question it leaves us: what drives a leader to place himself so close to danger, knowing the risks? Was it recklessness, or a higher calling? Perhaps Gustavus understood that true leadership is not commanding from a distance, but sharing the fate of those one leads. His sacrifice was both a loss and a gift, a final proof that he was willing to give everything for the cause he believed in. From the mist of Lutzen, his story reached its highest peak, the sacrifice of a king who chose to live and die as one with his people. Though Gustavus Adolphus fell at Lutzen, his victories and achievements did not die with him. In fact, his legacy only grew brighter in the years that followed, for his reforms had already reshaped the very foundation of warfare and leadership. On the battlefield, Gustavus had introduced innovations that made him the father of modern military science. His flexible use of combined arms, artillery, cavalry, and infantry working as one, set a new standard. He emphasized speed and coordination instead of sheer mass, turning clumsy medieval formations into agile, deadly instruments of war. His lighter artillery, able to move swiftly during battle, revolutionized the role of cannons, once thought of as slow and cumbersome. Armies across Europe studied his methods, and long after his death, generals from France, Prussia, and even as far as America would draw inspiration from his designs. Yet Gustavus's achievements went beyond strategy. He humanized the soldier's role in a way rare for his age. Rather than treating his men as disposable tools, he introduced regular pay, better conditions, and clear organization. He demanded discipline, but he also gave respect. This bond of trust between king and soldier created an army that fought with loyalty and heart, not just obligation. It was this spirit that carried them to victory even after his fall. Politically, his victories changed the balance of Europe. Before Gustavus, Sweden was considered a minor power, overshadowed by Denmark, Poland, and the great empires. By the time of his death, Sweden had risen to the rank of a great European power, commanding respect in the courts of kings and emperors. His campaigns in Germany had preserved the Protestant cause at its most vulnerable moment, preventing the Habsburgs from imposing complete domination. In many ways, he became not just Sweden's protector, but the champion of an entire movement for freedom of belief. His personal character also left an imprint that was as important as his victories. Gustavus was admired not only for his brilliance but for his humanity. He prayed with his men, shared their dangers, and carried himself with humility even in triumph. Unlike many rulers, he was not blinded by luxury or cruelty. His courage was matched by compassion, and that balance made him unforgettable. Even his enemies respected him. Reports tell of Catholic generals who, upon hearing of his death, acknowledged the loss of a great man. To inspire respect from friend and foe alike is perhaps the highest achievement any leader can hope for. One must also remember that Gustavus's reign was brief, just over 2 decades as king, and only a few years as the decisive force in Europe. Yet in that short time, he accomplished what others could not in a lifetime. He transformed Sweden from a vulnerable kingdom into a power, reshaped the art of war, and gave a voice of hope to millions who longed for freedom. It is often said that true greatness is not measured in years, but in impact. Gustavus Adolphus embodied that truth. His life ended at 37, but the world he left behind bore his fingerprints for centuries. So when we speak of victory, we do not speak only of battles won. We speak of values preserved, of courage passed down, and of a spirit that continues to inspire. In Gustavus's case, his achievements were not only for his own time, they were for all time. The story of Gustavus Adolphus is more than a tale of battles and politics. It is the journey of a man who rose from fragile beginnings, shouldered impossible burdens, and gave his life for something greater than himself. He was not destined for an easy reign. He inherited war, poverty, and suspicion. Yet from those hardships, he forged strength and vision. His legacy can be seen in 3 great lessons. First, the power of innovation. Gustavus did not accept the limitations of his time. He asked, "How can we do this differently? How can we do it better?" In doing so, he rewrote the art of war, proving that creativity and courage can overcome even overwhelming odds. For us today, the lesson is clear. When faced with obstacles, the path forward is not always repetition, but imagination. Second, the meaning of leadership. Gustavus did not hide behind titles or command from safety. He placed himself among his men, sharing danger and sacrifice. He earned loyalty not through fear, but through respect. Leadership, his life teaches us, is not about power alone. It is about responsibility, trust, and the willingness to serve. Third, the value of sacrifice. At Lutzen, Gustavus gave everything for his people and for the cause he believed in. Though his life was cut short, his ideals outlived him. True greatness is not measured in how long we live, but in what we are willing to give for others. Symbolically, Gustavus stands as the Lion of the North, not because he roared the loudest, but because he carried courage in his heart and gave strength to the weak. He became a symbol of resilience, of faith, and of vision. And so, his story is not only for historians or soldiers. It is for every learner, every dreamer, every person who faces struggles and wonders if they can overcome. His life answers, yes, you can. With courage, with innovation, and with resilience, even the smallest nation, or the most ordinary individual, can leave a mark that echoes across centuries. Now, dear learners, Let me ask you, if Gustavus could rise from hardship to greatness, what legacy do you wish to leave in your own life? Dear learners, you have now walked through the life of Gustavus Adolphus, the Lion of the North. You have seen a boy inherit a crown in the shadow of danger, grow into a leader through hardship, and finally give his life on the battlefield for the cause he believed in. His story is a reminder that greatness is not given, it is forged in fire, tested by struggle, and sealed by sacrifice. One of Gustavus's most remembered words is simple yet powerful: "I have resolved never to start an unjust war." In those words, we see the heart of his character. He was not driven by conquest for its own sake, but by the conviction that his fight was for justice, freedom, and the protection of his people. It is a lesson for us today, that even in conflict, there must be principle, even in power, there must be conscience. So let this story stay with you. Carry it not only as part of history, but as part of your own journey. You, too, face struggles, though they may not be on battlefields. You face doubts, obstacles, and choices. Remember Gustavus, and know that resilience, creativity, and integrity can guide you through. If this story touched you, share it with someone who might need inspiration. Like, comment, and subscribe, not only to support this channel, but to help spread lessons of hope and courage across the world. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep dreaming. This was the story of Gustavus Adolphus, the Lion of the North who changed warfare forever. Goodbye for now.